Hey, I'm that face icon, and this guy, this guy right here, this dude's a blatant white nationalist. And I'm gonna be real, I don't really mind white nationalist dudes just do what they do. They believe what they want, whatever. I usually like watching their shit because I like to see how ridiculous their arguments are. Just a small little hobby of mine. But what I do have a problem with is my friend here, the Quartering, shouting out a blatant white nationalist on his channel to his huge YouTube fan base.
Let's look at a real-world example here in Battlefield 5, and this is brought by American Krogan, and I will link his full video in the description below. I thought he did an absolutely stellar job. Not only was I entertained by his video, but I was also educated a little bit on World War II history. Now, certainly I could point out the absurdity of this woman overpowering and doing all the things that she's doing, but I think it's fair to say it's equally unlikely that a single two-man team would accomplish everything this two-woman team accomplished. But let's look at why there's an issue with this and why they're probably women. So here we have another perfect example of revisionism, meaning the clear historical inaccuracy that this team was two lone women, when in fact they were 4 Norwegian men, as well as another team of men coming in later. Now, is it that big of a deal? Probably not. But when you put everything together and you can see the exact type of people that they're pandering to, now I have a problem with it. You're rewriting history for Metacritic scores and money. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure you check out the 2 creators that I featured because their content seems far superior to mine, and it is a damn shame that both of those videos didn't get 1 million views each. I hope you enjoyed this video.
Now, I'm gonna be honest, I don't agree with the Quartering on pretty much anything. But that's not really the point of this video. But what I do think I agree with him on is that he disagrees fundamentally with the alt-right and other white nationalist sort of groups. At least I thought so. And I'm not saying that he did this proactively or he meant to or whatever the case may be, because as we're going to go into this dude American Krogan, every single one of his videos are like a calling card to radicalize somebody into the alt-right way of thinking. And as an example, I'm just going to use the most recent video he posted and maybe some conversations that I had with American Krogan in the past and present the information, and you can agree or disagree or whatever, but let's check it out. Now, the video in question is Battlefield 5 Inclusive Revisionism. I do plan to do a full video going in depth to really see if this guy's telling the truth or not and his framing of the Battlefield 5 campaign, but none of that really matters for my argument. If I were to boil down the video, it's him talking about a fictional story that DICE in no way has ever claimed to not be a fictional story, and taking all the parts that are fiction and saying, hey, you made this fiction for historical revisionism. Do we call the Patriot historical revisionism? Do we call Pearl Harbor historical revisionism? Why don't we see this argument from somebody like him a little bit more consistently? If something is working in the realm of fiction, it can do whatever the fuck it wants. And at the same time, if that's just his point, is that's all he's trying to say, that's chill. If it's just, hey, these are the real stories behind the inspiration of these events, cool, right? Isn't this cool? Especially the SAS soldiers that he mentioned, with the guy sneaking up on the boat and taking something from the other ship. That's an awesome story that is really cool to, tell your audience about. But it's not about that. It's blaming every single aspect of fiction onto a leftist revisionist bend, and that's just fucking stupid. And to be clear, I am not claiming that you cannot critique certain acts of fiction by not playing to the actual historical accuracy of these events. I don't necessarily have a problem with that, but what I do have a problem with is when people take these inconsistencies that exist in all types of media and a lot of movies in the past, but single this out to be a problem. Don't get me wrong, a lot of people have a problem with movies doing like this. If you want movies to always take historical precedent over any situation, yeah, that's a good place to start. You can actually argue for something like that, but I'm okay with people taking history and crafting fiction around it, especially things that are loosely based in somewhat fact. I'm okay with that, and I don't really think Battlefield crosses the line here. Many stories change the name of the protagonists, from their personalities to their entire framework or motivation as a character, or as an actual person that existed within history. But most people don't tend to have a problem with it, especially not the same problem as the backlash that we see when it comes to Battlefield. And I'm not really tone deaf onto the situation either. I get it, people are frustrated, and even though I think the women in Battlefield argument is really, really, really dumb, I mean, are we gonna hold every other game to this ridiculous standards? All of the campaigns of that Call of Duty has produced in the years. If these stories don't fit 100% to the historical precedent or the historical literature, are we gonna crucify them as well? Probably not. Because when you do that and you hold everything to that type of standard, you start to realize that almost every movie depicting any sort of historical event whatsoever is vastly out of proportion to reality. So you're honestly fighting a losing battle. But even with those criticisms, that's not really that big of a deal. But what I do have a problem with is the very sly rhetoric being pushed throughout the video. You can blink and you miss it, but you sense this type of stance in a lot of American Krogan's videos, to the point where it sent me red flags in the past.
Well, I've reached my tolerance threshold. I want my people and my culture to keep going. I don't want to be replaced. I want to come home to America one day and be able to speak English with everyone I see. I want to see people who look like me because that is where I feel most welcomed. Just as the xenophobic immigrants in New Hampshire feel most welcomed around people like themselves. Why can people of color embrace their identity, but I can't embrace mine? As a German American, why can't I look at other German Americans and see that maybe I have more in common with them than I do with blacks or Hispanics? That's not a message of hate, it's a message of camaraderie. The painfully simple truth is that if you look at a world map of IQ distribution and match that up with historical and cultural achievements before and after colonialism, the history of the world and the current state of affairs make a lot more sense. It wasn't. But was it a proportionate response for hundreds of thousands of people on the internet to berate her when she had only berated a single man? No, it wasn't. But was it right? Perhaps so. Overwhelming one's opposition with forced concentration is a valid military tactic that works. Think of the disproportionate response to a few tweets about Doom as a bombing run on enemy aircraft before they can take off. Sure, it's not fair, but it does work. War isn't fair, and yes, we are in a culture war today, not issues. In any event, even if id Software is simply pandering to anti-SJWs, I don't really care, because the end result is largely the same. Yes, I have complained about politics in games in the past, but why would I condemn id Software and their potential anti-globalist message if I agree with it? Yeah, I might be called a hypocrite if I don't, but I'm already called a racist xenophobe half the time. The UAC is thus the true cause behind the interdimensional conflict, not the demons. The demons aren't actually evil per se. It could be argued that they would simply be better off staying in their own world where they belong. The thing is, following this line of reasoning, the UAC and demons can still be considered a proxy for globalists and immigrants, respectively. Sean pointed out that demons aren't the real villains in Doom, but this almost perfectly parallels real life insofar that immigrants aren't the real villains either. Globalists are. Now, if you really want to go down a rabbit hole, not only is Olivia Pierce's aim to have an open border between hell and earth, but she also wants humans to meld with demons. Most white people clinging to the nurture and cultural side of the debate have never actually lived and worked in a society where the average IQs are between 70 and 85. Instead of burying our heads in the sand, what we should be doing is researching ways to increase their intelligence via some kind of gene therapy. But no one is allowed to do this kind of research because of political correctness.
You come from every walk of life, every race, color, and creed. But you all share one very important trait. You are this country's best and brightest. But more importantly, you'll always be my family.
Goodbye! Aloha! Ciao! Arrivederci!
So, it would seem that at this point, not only was there no common ethnicity or religion that bound Americans together in 2077, but there was no common language either. Now, I know it seems like I'm being a finicky, xenophobic stickler here, but in all seriousness, why would a Mr. Handy robot be telling people goodbye in a variety of foreign languages as they left an American vault? Now, I know I'll lose a few subs for bringing it up, but yes, there is a huge international push for people to race mix. Look, if people want to do that on their own, that's perfectly fine. I just don't know why it needs to be advertised, promoted, and pushed. Basically, what it's saying is that we don't like whites, blacks, and Asians, and we don't think they're worth keeping around as they are.
Now, with all that being shown, I plan to do an in-depth analysis of a couple of this dude's videos, one of which including why men like open world games more than women, and a few others, but that's probably going to be like the most recent one. This guy said some pretty egregious things, and, go through and, check those videos, see if I took them out of context. It's kind of hard to take them out of context, at least when it comes to the interracial, mixing conspiracy. But on to criticizing his actual video. While I don't know if the way that he framed all of these historical events to be absolutely true, it's pretty clear that he just went to a Wikipedia article and started reading it straight off the rip. And here's that Wikipedia article here. Now, while I may not be a historian, I am an expert in dog whistle politics. And there were a few red flags. For one, he was talking about the historian Raphael Scheck, and he makes it a point to outline the fact that he's Jewish.
I don't believe it is productive or fair to Germans that DICE portrays them all as having been so merciless. For example, we know that Germany took some 30,000 black African French troops prisoner and housed them until the end of the war. Jewish historian Raphael Scheck said in his book about French colonial prisoners that, quote, in marked contrast to other racially stigmatized groups such as Jews and Gypsies, French colonial soldiers did not experience an escalation of brutality under the control of Nazi Germany. In fact, taken as a whole, the experiences of colonial POWs were neither better nor worse than those of white POWs, unquote. Now, it's true that many black POWs died in German captivity, but this was a fate shared by other Allied prisoners and was mostly due to disease and logistical problems at the end of the war, not systematic extermination. Most people don't know this, but the Germans had a few black troops themselves. Sure, there weren't many of them, and it's not like the Germans considered them their equals, but again, it wasn't official German policy to exterminate any and all brown people they came across. In fact, there are some interesting accounts of German POWs in Texas who found the treatment of African Americans there quite deplorable. To be clear though, I am not trying to discount any atrocities committed by the Germans. I'm simply asking that we view history with a sense of proportion, rather than continue down this endless, multi-generational German guilt trip.
Weird, but that doesn't really lead to any real conclusions, right? Just a weird way to frame that person. And while that being a legitimate quote from one of his books, the entire book in question is about the mistreatment of these African colonial soldiers by the treatment of the Germans. So, without being a historical major myself, I took to the subreddit Ask Historians and provided him with the quote in question. This is his response. I can confirm that the quote is taken from the book French Colonial Soldiers in German Captivity During World War II by Raphael Scheck, page 8 through 9. In terms of accuracy, that's how far the above claim goes. What we see in this video, and the above quote taken from it, is cherry picking at its best, and with no understanding of the realities of the dangers and threats posed by prisoners of war of African descent. The video in question is an egregious mix of opinion, distorted facts, and downright falsehoods taken from dubious sources or cherry-picked from legitimate ones. All to make a case against leftist inclusion. The fact that the video highlights the fact that Scheck is Jewish, something that has nothing to do with his skill as a scholar or reputation, should be obvious to anyone that these are not arguments made in good faith. The reality of the matter is that the video in question has cherry-picked Sheck's argument. Without a doubt, Sheck is not wrong. However, as a scholar that he is, he puts in the effort to contextualize it. Sheck is writing primarily of French colonial soldiers in French POW camps. This is prisoners of war that have been taken captive and processed to a camp where they were housed and guarded. Later on, he writes, this leaves us with the question, what about the initial capture as portrayed in Battlefield 5? As in 1940, German propaganda aimed at colonial soldiers, portraying them as bloodthirsty savages, mixed with calls of revenge, racial hatred, and accusations of the mutilization of German troops by colonial soldiers repeatedly led to the killing of captured colonial soldiers. As Sheck writes on page 32, quote, being taken prisoner was a dangerous moment for all soldiers, but colonial soldiers, and particularly blacks, were exposed to the greatest dangers. End quote. Had American Krogan actually read the book he cites from, he would have known this, since Sheck did not make this a secret, and writes in the first chapter of his book about it. Now with that being said, asking a Reddit dedicated to getting your questions answered by historians could be wrong, and by the end of the day, it's just one man's word against another, am I right? But let's look at Sheck's words himself, actually.
This book is about massacres of black French soldiers. So these were soldiers who had been drafted by the French army in Africa, mostly sub-Saharan Africa, Senegal, Mali, and countries in that region. And they were brought to France in 1939 and 1940, and they fought against the German army. When the German army captured these soldiers and made them prisoner, many officers ordered that they be executed and massacred right upon capture. And I estimate that around 3,000 of them were killed right after capture. Many more were killed on the way to POW camps. So they were treated in a quite abhorrent way. And the motivation for this was racism. And what is important in this context is that the German campaign in France is so often portrayed as a campaign where there's not yet that massive racism that played out on the Eastern Front toward the Russians, toward Jews, toward Poles already earlier on. And my book wanted to show that the Nazi regime was indoctrinating the German people and the German army already during the French campaign in a strong racist sense, and that this led to these massacres of black soldiers.
So I guess American Krogan is right. It was an official German policy, but they definitely inspired the feelings and fueled the propaganda against it. And speaking of propaganda, while watching the video, I felt extremely creeped and weirded out by the backgrounds that he showed while trying to present the argument that these colonial French soldiers were treated just as bad as everybody else. I mean, Raphael Sheck said it. It doesn't matter if I took this clip completely out of context. But even with that being said, those clips still made me feel kind of weird. Those quick zoom in on the faces, them cutting an animal apart, the weird smiles and the strange dancing. It almost seems tribal. And I don't know where he found these clips from, but something about it just doesn't seem right. And of course, I ended up finding out where these clips came from. The clips that he shows in this video are the German propaganda films to incite the hatred of the German people against colonial African soldiers, to make them seem stupid, savage, animalistic. Raphael Sheck highlights it in this quick video.
Before the massacres happened, there was a massive press campaign in the German media. And this campaign was ordered by Hitler personally, because he felt that after The first successes in that campaign, the British were beaten and were leaving Europe through Dunkirk. Hitler felt that the German soldiers did not hate the French enough. So how do you get the German soldier to hate the French more? He thought, and he agreed with Goebbels, with his propaganda minister on this, make a lot of noise about the African soldiers in the French army, depict them as man-eating savages, as mutilating savages. And Nazi propaganda worked very centrally at this time. So Goebbels was off the phone with Hitler, immediately gave the orders, and the next day articles kept appearing about savage African soldiers who were cutting to pieces German prisoners in France. There were basically German propaganda teams or camera teams who went into the camps and who had instructions, and they found those instructions in the archives. Go and look for animalistic scenes. So film soldiers or prisoners while they were doing things that animals do. And so these camera teams zoomed in, for example, on soldiers who were eating raw meat because they were starving in these camps. At first, in the beginning, the supply situation was terrible. So these camera teams filmed prisoners, black prisoners, and also sometimes North African prisoners, tearing apart raw cows or raw sheep and eating the meat. Other propaganda teams, and they did this for many months afterwards, also when some of these prisoners were first brought to Germany, before everybody got Hitler's order that they were actually supposed to be kept in France. There were propaganda teams who went into the POW camps in Germany and filmed dances of these soldiers, and often they told them, dance like we're used to. And many of these African soldiers came from very different regions in Africa. Well, we're supposed to dance like we do. Well, we are not we are from very different areas here. We dance differently. So they started usually dancing under pressure. And these camera teams filmed this. And if we watch them today, we might think, oh well, just a bunch of black men in French uniforms dancing. But the way they were presented to the German audiences at the time is so basically to underscore that these soldiers from Africa are primitive, that they are dancing primitive dances and behaving in ways that are more befitting of an animal than a human. And this went so far that the official Nazi newspaper said, sort of as a rhetorical question, do you think that these soldiers ought to be spared and be taken into a POW camp? So the implication was these people are free for murder. And the German soldiers read these articles, they heard news like that on the radio. And when they attacked in a second wave in early June 1940, they began to read everything in the battle situation according to Nazi propaganda. So whenever they found one of their comrades with severe cutting wounds, for example, they immediately thought, oh, this person must have been a prisoner of a black unit and they must have cut that person to pieces. And then officers, when they captured black soldiers, said, now we are going to avenge these outrages, and very often officers ordered that the black soldiers be separated from the white soldiers and also from the North Africans, who were usually put together with the white soldiers, and then the black soldiers were led away. Very often it was execution at the edge of a forest, at the end of a field.
1,850,000 soldiers are taken prisoner, along with 36,000 officers and 176 generals. Among the prisoners, there are many African soldiers from the French colonial troops. The Wehrmacht's amateur filmmakers film them with a perverse sense of self-satisfaction. Famished, these soldiers kill a goat. German propaganda newsreels insist on showing repeated close-ups of their faces. The official instructions are to portray the degeneration of the French, who are forced to go to war with their slaves from their colonies. The original German commentary is revealing.
Vor wenigen Tagen noch erklärte Chamberlain einem Amerikaner gegenüber, dass England und seine Verbündeten sich als Treuhänder der Zivilisation im Kampfe gegen mittelalterliche Barbarei fühlten. Das sind also die Treuhänder der Kultur.
3,000 African soldiers and officers from the French army will be shot and killed after they're captured. After 7 years of Nazi indoctrination, racism is rampant among the German soldiers.
For him to use this footage completely out of context, while at the same time speaking about the general equality of how these African troops were treated, is really weird. Using these clips without the context of what they were actually repurposes these clips to actual propaganda and then sell it toward people who don't know any better. And I'm gonna be honest, I didn't know any better either until I searched in the National Geographic footage, which I'm pretty sure he got it from, and he just cropped out the National Geographic label and the bottom that says, hey, this is German propaganda. And finally, I looked all over to find a citation or a belief or a historian to back up the claim that the TLGU, I can't pronounce these words, I don't speak that, he's good at that, were taking women as prisoners and the French troops just being passive in it. All of his explanations or sources of the events lead to almost absolutely nothing, and he just used some stupid cop-out phrase like some historians or some accounts at the time. How do you backtrack that? How do you even get to the example to find out if what he's saying is true or not? It's bullshit. But honestly, if you know what he's talking about, link it and I'll gladly take a look. So, some of you may not be convinced. And you know what? That's okay. Maybe the cries of an international race-mixing conspiracy, which is so often seen in alt-right talking circles, maybe that's not enough. So I talked to American Krogan, admittedly with the aim to actually get a debate and pick his brain, because at the time it was more of a fascination or an interest. And believe it or not, he was actually able to fit me in through his busy schedule of constantly retweeting race realist arguments and screeching about a great replacement. I actually was able to pick his brain a little bit. Based on what people say, you can really get an idea of what they actually think. Europeans also, on average, have higher spatial reasoning skills and a lower time preference than other groups. This in part accounts for the types of technology and cultural advancements Europeans have made. And if I could just translate this, his argument is literally because their IQ is better, Europeans have a better civilization than most other countries. Which is so stupid and reductionary. The idea that you can take current trends in terms of intelligence or IQ testing and extrapolate that into all of history into explaining, at least partly, why European society is so much better, you're ignoring the context, you're ignoring the history, you're ignoring the circumstances that got you there, but then lumping all that, at least in part, to IQ? What kind of part are we talking here? I mean, it must have been pretty big for you to mention that it was somewhat of a part of it. And finally, the only really thing of note at the conversation is, I tried to get him into the usual catch-22 that catches most fucking Nazis. And that's to make a distinction between ancestry and skin color. Because those two things don't match up all the way. And there are a lot of exceptions to that rule, hence why people think race is more of a social construct than an actual biological term. Now that's neither here or there, but I showed American Krogan a picture of a black family that gave birth to a seemingly white child. And I went ahead and linked him this article. Now, a little bit of context, I don't even know if this is necessarily true. At least the article pointed to the fact that it could be albinoism, or a rare form of it at least. And yeah, I could have used real world examples of people that don't look like the race that we commonly attribute them to. There are plenty of people who look one particular race, but is mixed or something like that. But that's not the point. Because every point in this conversation beforehand, he always labeled these things under ancestry. So, okay, we can poke holes in that pretty easy. So I have a question for you, American Krogan. With this little girl here, if she was to grow up and maintain the way she looks currently, would you want to live around her? Knowing that most of her ancestry is probably of African descent? Would you be comfortable knowing that her ancestry doesn't match, but her looks does? Because ultimately that's the problem with white nationalism. It holds up the concept of whiteness like it's something inherently real, like it's something that should be praised just because you have fair skin. And that's chill. Be proud of the skin that you have. But whiteness as a concept was made out of exclusion, was made out of subjugation. And every other concept of race was built around that dominance. But in the real world, ancestry doesn't match up all the way. And there's a lot of mixing at the ends. So much so, if you look at the current consensus and scientific opinion, race is nothing more than a social construct, an arbitrary classification of human ancestral tests and genetic markers. This presents the problem. Someone can look like a certain race whose ancestral ties will tell a completely different story. I mean, look at it. There's plenty of people who come from white and black parents as interracial couples, but then they present as heavily one race rather than the other. These people's mere existence calls into their question ancestry and their immediate ties to race, because someone can look completely white but be half black, and vice versa. I mean, there's even twins born to interracial couples where one has the dark skin trait and the other one would have lighter skin traits. But it won't stop white nationalists to try to jam in their view of race into ancestral testing, and they probably won't stop anytime soon. Because to them, all white people are monolithic. To them, you're all the same. All the different cultures and things that make you separate and great and actually have a sort of historical context and people, they try to lump you guys all together. And then they do that with the same with African Americans, Asians, and such and so forth. The mere suggestion that I'm just the same or have genetic propensity and certain cultural standings as someone in Africa being born and raised in America my entire life is absolutely absurd. The only thing that we share at that point is a skin color. And also the mutual subjugation and oppression from the system, but whatever. And with that being said, American Krogan's never said he's been for something like an ethno-state. Even though he screeches about all the other white nationalist talking points, he stays far away from that one, so good for him. That's pretty cool. But, and while I may be wrong, when it comes to these type of people, the way you look really is all that matters. They like to shape it up as to be more than skin deep or to be more rooted in science than what it actually is. But honestly, are you brown? Well, shit. Tough luck, kid. But on a serious note, I'm pretty sure American Krogan knows where I was coming from with this. Yet he completely jumped out of the conversation by calling me nothing more than a troll when confronted with this catch-22. Before making this video, I also contacted American Krogan again to tell them the things that I found about his video that I found disturbing, and to label him with what he truly is. When confronting him with the things that I found in this video that I thought were wrong, disturbing, and dog whistled to some pretty extremist shit, talking about how I actually searched down and read Sheck's book, went through his sources, found his lies, his out-of-context German Nazi propaganda, and confronting him with this knowledge, he just calls me a troll again and moves on with his day. So, I think I got my point across. If you don't really think American Krogan's still packing some pretty questionable views, I don't know what to say to you at this point. But overall, like I said, him being this way, him having these beliefs, aren't really that big of a deal. He's one of many that pushes narratives using a sort of centrist, apolitical bend. And he's not the only one, and he won't be the last. But what is important is to be able to call out his ideology for what it is. And while I didn't do a big takedown on his fundamentals ideas, which is videos I plan to do later, by the way, we need to start from some sort of framework and understand what his thoughts, what his goals, what he thinks is good political perspective, to have a good platform in order to attack his views head on. I don't want to beat around the bush. I don't want to bullshit. I don't want to call somebody what they're not. But if it looks like a dog, talks like a dog, it barks like a dog, I guess that's what you need to call it, right? And last thing, this isn't something that you can really skim away from. The quartering, and I might list a few more people here who directly gave a response to this dude's video, hyping him up or saying that this video is something that you need to see. And I'm not saying that these are inherently terrible people because they did something like this, while I disagree with the quartering about almost literally everything. If you choose to not stand for something like this, and you happen to come across this video, maybe you could not promote this person anymore. And maybe that whenever somebody would search American Krogan's name, you would have this argument, this outline of his beliefs. I'm sure they're going to become more radical with time, and I'm sure he's going to get more popularity for having these radical beliefs. But hey, I'm just one guy with no online presence trying to shout out somebody that I think is a problem. And you know what? That's what fucking YouTube's for, man. But as far as tackling his future points, I'm probably going to start with why men like open world games more than women and start from there. I work full time, so that video is going to take a while and it's hopefully better edited. But until next time, peace.